The frost came early that year, and it came hard, settling over the Dakota flatland like a judgment nobody had asked for. 25-year-old Odessa Ferris stood in the doorway of the hen house at 5 in the morning, watching her breath curl into the dark, and counted the eggs in the nesting boxes for the third day running. 4 eggs from 61 hens. She wrote the number down in a ledger with the cover gone soft and gray from handling. The same ledger her husband Thomas had kept before the fever took him in November, 11 months into their marriage, and 4 months into her carrying a hope that never came to term either. The hens huddled on their roosts, feathers puffed against the cold, and they looked at her the way the whole county looked at her now, with a kind of patient waiting to see how badly she would fail. She latched the henhouse door against the wind and walked back to the main house past a thermometer nailed to the porch post, its needle sitting at 11 degrees. And she noted that, too, because Thomas had always said that a farm run on guesses was a farm already sold. The Ferris egg operation had been modest but steady when Thomas was alive. 61 Plymouth Rocks and a scattering of Wyandottes, producing enough eggs to supply the general store in town and 2 of the boarding houses besides. Thomas had inherited the flock from his own father, along with $400 of debt on the barn itself, a debt that came due each spring to the bank in Larkspur Crossing. He had a plan to clear it, something to do with keeping the hens laying through the worst months, instead of losing 3/4 of the flock's output to the cold, the way every other farmer in the territory did. But he had never finished explaining it to Odessa before the fever put him in the ground under a plain marker with no carving on it, nothing but his name and 2 dates, 7 months apart. She had found his journal 2 weeks after the funeral, tucked behind a loose board in the tack room, its pages filled with sketches of coop layouts, notes on grain rations, temperatures recorded morning and night for a full winter before this one. The last entry, dated the previous January, read only, "If I can keep the house at 50 degrees through February, I believe the count will hold at 30 a day instead of falling to 5. Have not solved the heat yet. Straw is not enough. We'll think on it more once the roof is patched." He had never gotten to think on it more. The roof had been patched by a hired man in March, and then Thomas had been dead by November. And now it was Odessa alone in a house too quiet, with a debt of $400 coming due in April, and a flock producing 4 eggs when it needed to produce closer to 30. She had told no one in town how bad it truly was. Pride kept her upright some mornings when nothing else did. But numbers did not care about pride, and by the 3rd week of December, she had done the arithmetic more times than she cared to admit. At 4 eggs a day, sold at 18 cents a dozen, when she could even get a dozen together, she would clear perhaps $6 a month from the flock, against a debt that needed $400 paid by the 15th of April, 108 days away. The bank would not extend her further. Mr. Alden Pruitt at the bank had made that plain enough, in a tone that suggested sympathy while offering none of the substance of it. It was on the 23rd of December that Harmon Voss came riding up the frozen lane in his good coat, the one he wore to church and to negotiations, and Odessa knew before he opened his mouth what he had come to say. Voss ran the largest spread in the county, 400 acres of cattle and a growing interest, everyone said, in buying up the smaller, failing farms around Larkspur Crossing for pennies against their debts. He was not a cruel man, not exactly. He simply believed, with the flat certainty of a man who had never needed to hope for anything, that sentiment had no place in business, and that a widow alone with 61 half-frozen hens was a fact to be managed rather than a person to be persuaded. He did not dismount. That was its own kind of message. "Mrs. Ferris," he said, touching his hat, "I'll not waste your morning. I know what your flock is producing this month, because everyone in 3 miles knows it, whether you've told them or not. Chickens talk through their silence, same as people do. I'm prepared to offer you $250 for the land, the barn, and what's left of the birds. It's more than the flock is worth to anyone but you." Odessa stood with her hands folded in her apron, feeling the cold bite through her stockings, and did not let her face show the calculation running behind it. $250 would not clear the debt. It would leave her $150 short, and without a home besides. "That offer doesn't cover what I owe the bank, Mr. Voss," she said. "I'd be trading a debt for homelessness." "You'd be trading a debt you cannot pay for $250 you can use to start fresh somewhere with less winter in it," Voss said. "I mean that plainly, not unkindly. Thomas was a good man, but he died with a debt on this place that a woman alone cannot work off in 4 months. I'd rather see you take the sensible road now than watch the bank take everything in April and leave you with nothing at all." "I appreciate the visit," Odessa said, "but I have not decided to sell anything." "You've got until April to decide," Voss said, gathering his reins. "The offer stands until the 15th. After that, I'll be bidding at whatever the bank sets, and it won't be $250. He rode off without further ceremony, and Odessa watched him go down the lane until the cold made her eyes water, and she told herself that was the only reason. That night she sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's journal open under the lamp, reading again the entries from the winter before, the temperatures recorded twice daily, the sketches of coop interiors with notes in the margins about draft and ventilation. 50 degrees, he had written. If I can keep the house at 50 degrees through February. She turned the page looking for more, for the answer he had promised himself he would find, but there was nothing else, only blank pages after that, because he had stopped writing sometime in the spring when the work of the farm outpaced his notebook, and then he had gotten sick, and then there had been no more entries at all. She sat with the notebook a long while, running her thumb over his handwriting, feeling the particular ache of a puzzle left unsolved by a hand that would never pick it up again. It was 2 days after Christmas, which had passed with little marking beyond a small dinner and a quiet, unspoken grief, that Odessa walked the half-mile to the Ostrander place to return a borrowed lantern, and found herself sitting a while at the kitchen table of Prudence Ostrander, a widow of 61 years who had buried 2 husbands and outlived a good portion of her own children's early hopes, and who now kept 11 goats and a garden and very little conversation for anyone who didn't need it. Prudence poured coffee without being asked, and set a plate of hard biscuits between them, and said nothing for a long time, only looked at Odessa with an assessing patience that felt somehow less invasive than Voss's flat calculation had. "You've got the look of a woman doing sums she doesn't like the answer to," Prudence said finally. 4 eggs a day, Odessa said. 61 hens and 4 eggs a day. Voss came by with an offer that doesn't cover the debt. Prudence nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Your Thomas came by here more than once last winter," she said, "asking about heat. Wanted to know how my Wendell kept his hogs from losing weight in the cold back before he passed. I told him what I could, which wasn't much. But I'll tell you something I never told him, because he didn't ask the right question. It isn't only heat a hen wants in the winter, it's light. A hen's laying is tied to daylight hours near as much as warmth, maybe more. My Wendell used to hang a lantern in the barn on a chain, timed so it came on before dawn, and stretched the hens' daylight longer than the sky was giving them. Kept his layers going through the worst months, while every other farm's flock went quiet. Odessa sat very still. A lantern on a schedule. 14 hours of light is what he aimed for, Prudence said. Sun alone won't give a hen that in December. You want the birds thinking it's still autumn, near as you can trick 'em into it. Warmth helps, but it's the light that tells a hen's body to keep producing. She took a slow sip of her coffee. Wendell's dead 9 years now, and I still keep a lamp burning for my goats out of habit, though goats don't need it the same way. Don't imagine your Thomas ever heard the particular details before he passed. Man asked good questions, just ran out of time to hear the answers. Odessa walked home that afternoon with the cold biting less than it had going out, turning the idea over and over. Light, not only heat. Thomas had been chasing half the answer, fixed on 50 degrees and drafts and straw, when the other half had been sitting in Prudence Ostrander's memory the whole time, waiting for someone to ask the right way. She thought of the journal entry again. Have not solved the heat yet, will think on it more. He had died still thinking heat was the whole problem. She would not make the same narrow guess. That evening she took stock of what she had. 6 kerosene lanterns of varying age and reliability. A hen house with 2 rooms, the main roosting room, and a smaller room Thomas had built for brooding hens that stood mostly empty now. $40 in a tin box under the floorboard, all that remained after the funeral costs, and a winter's worth of feed already purchased. 105 days until the debt came due. She sat at the table with the journal and a fresh sheet of paper and began to sketch the way Thomas used to, drawing the hen house from above, marking where a lantern might hang, calculating by hand how many hours of daylight the shortest days of the year actually offered against how many hours a laying hen needed to keep her body believing it was still a season of plenty. The math was not kind at first. Sunrise near 7:30, sunset before 5 in the afternoon, a scant 9 hours of daylight in the deep of winter. To reach 14 hours, she would need to add 5 hours of artificial light, which meant lanterns lit well before dawn and kept burning into the evening both, burning through oil she could scarcely afford to buy more of. She sat with that problem for 2 nights running, unable to see past it, until she remembered something Thomas had mentioned once in passing, months before he died, about a farmer 2 counties over who ran a length of stovepipe from his kitchen fire through the wall into an attached lean-to shed to keep his tools from freezing. If heat could be piped through a wall for free, borrowed from a fire already burning for the house's own sake, then perhaps light could be borrowed too, in its own fashion, not by burning more oil than she had, but by trimming down the number of lanterns needed and running them longer and smarter, and by building reflectors to throw what light she had further across the roosting room instead of losing half of it to the dark corners. She spent 3 days salvaging tin from an old wash basin gone rusted through at the bottom, and from the lids of grain tins, hammering them flat and curving them behind the lantern hooks Thomas had already mounted along the henhouse wall, angling each one by trial and correction until the light thrown from a single lantern reached twice as far as it had bare. It was not elegant work. Her hands blistered and then calloused over the hammering, and twice she burned her fingers testing the angle of a reflector too close to a lit wick. But by the 4th of January, she had rigged 4 lanterns with reflectors along the main roosting wall, and 1 more in the smaller room, and she had built, out of a discarded clock mechanism Thomas kept in a drawer of odd parts, a crude timing device that could be wound to release a latch and douse the wick at a set hour, so that she would not need to rise in the black middle of the night to extinguish a flame herself, risking the whole henhouse to fire for the sake of a few eggs. The first week of the new arrangement, the count crept from 4 to 7. She recorded it in the ledger each evening with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, aware that 7 eggs a day, while double what she'd had, was still a wide gulf from the 30 Thomas had once believed possible. She adjusted the lantern hours, moving the morning light earlier by half an hour, watching the hens' behavior each dawn to see whether they roused and moved toward the feed troughs sooner. By the second week, the count reached 11. By the third week, 14. She began selling again in modest quantities to the general store, and the store owner, a heavy-set man named Otis Redfern, who had known Thomas for years, looked at the eggs she brought him with open surprise. "Didn't figure you'd have anything to bring me this deep in winter, Mrs. Ferris," he said, weighing the basket. "Half the farms round here have gone dark on eggs till March." "We found a way to keep the hens thinking it's still autumn," Odessa said, and did not elaborate further, because word traveled fast in Larkspur Crossing, and she did not intend to hand Voss or anyone else a free lesson in what she'd built before the debt was cleared. Still, 14 eggs a day at 18 cents a dozen was not enough, not with only 105 days narrowing steadily toward fewer, and she knew it. She sat with the ledger most evenings doing the arithmetic again and again, watching the gap between what she had and what she needed shrink too slowly to save her by April. It was on a night in mid-January, cold enough that the water in the kitchen basin had skinned over with ice by morning, that she pulled out Thomas's journal once more, hunting for anything else he might have written that she had missed, and found, folded into the back cover where she had not thought to look before, a single loose page in a different ink, dated some 3 years earlier, before their marriage even, in Thomas's younger and less careful hand. It was a rough plan for expanding the flock by hatching eggs through the winter using a heated box instead of waiting for spring broodiness, a way to have young pullets coming into their first laying season by early summer instead of midsummer, catching the market before every other farm's late-hatched birds came into production and drove the price down. He had written beneath the sketch, "Needs a steady heat source that won't need tending through the night. Have not solved it. Ask Ostrander." He had meant to ask Wendell Ostrander, she realized, the same neighbor whose widow had given her the answer about light, and he had never gotten the chance, because Wendell had died before Thomas ever got around to the asking. And then Thomas himself had run out of time entirely. She walked to the Ostrander place again the following afternoon, this time with a specific question instead of only grief to carry, and found Prudence in her kitchen shelling the last of a dried bean harvest into a bowl. Odessa laid out Thomas's old sketch and explained what she was hoping to solve. "A heat box that tends itself through the night," Prudence said, studying the drawing. "Wendell built such a thing, matter of fact, years before he passed, for hatching guinea fowl eggs out of season. Used a double-walled box, the space between the walls packed with fresh manure. Manure breaks down and gives off its own heat as it composts, steady as you like. No fire needed, no tending through the night beyond checking the temperature now and again with a thermometer stuck through a hole in the side. Kept a box like that at near 90 degrees for weeks without a single flame lit under it. She tapped the sketch. Your Thomas had the shape of it right, just didn't know what to pack the walls with. It took Odessa 9 days to build the box, working in the evenings after the hens were fed and the lanterns tended, using scrap lumber from a collapsed section of the old smokehouse and manure gathered fresh each morning from the barn, packed carefully into the cavity between inner and outer walls the way Prudence described. She tested the internal temperature obsessively at first, adjusting the thickness of the manure packing, adding more when the heat dropped, venting a small gap when it climbed too high, until she found a balance that held steady near 99 degrees for 3 days running without her touching it beyond a morning check. On the 10th day, she set 6 dozen eggs into the box, selected from her best layers, and began the long wait of 21 days to see whether any of it would hatch into something living. Meanwhile, the lantern-lit henhouse kept climbing in its output, slow and steady, the daily count reaching 18 by the end of January, then 21 by the second week of February, close enough now to Thomas's hoped-for 30 that Odessa allowed herself, for the first time since the fever took him, a small private measure of something like hope. She sold eggs steadily to Redfern's store now, and to one of the boarding houses that had gone without a reliable supplier since autumn, and the tin box under the floorboard began, slowly, to fill. It was in the middle of February, with the debt deadline 60 days off and the count sitting at 23, that Voss rode up the lane again, this time on a colder morning than the first visit, his breath fogging thick around his collar. "I hear your flock's doing better than folks expected, Mrs. Ferris," he said, not dismounting this time either, though there was something less certain in his voice than there had been in December. "Redfern's been talking about it at the store. Says you're bringing eggs in through the deep of winter, when nobody else in 3 counties can manage more than a handful." "We've made some improvements to the hen house," Odessa said. "I'll be straight with you," Voss said. "I still don't believe you'll clear $400 by April, not from a flock that size, however clever the improvements. 23 eggs a day is a fine thing, but it isn't enough, and I expect you know that better than I do, since you're the one keeping the ledger. My offer's still open, and I'll sweeten it some, given what you've managed. $300 for the place and the flock both, and I'll let you keep whatever coin you've earned so far besides. It's a fair offer for a farm most men would have already walked away from." Odessa looked at him a long moment, feeling the wind pull at the edges of her shawl, and thought of Thomas's unfinished journal, of 99 degrees held steady by nothing but composting manure and careful tending, of Prudence Ostrander's quiet decade of small, unspoken knowledge waiting for someone to think to ask. "I don't believe I'll be taking that offer either, Mr. Voss," she said. "I've got 60 days left, and a flock that's improving every week. I'd rather find out for myself whether it's enough than sell out on a guess that it isn't." Voss studied her face for a moment, something shifting behind his own expression that was not quite respect but was moving in that direction. "60 days, he said. "I'll come back on the 15th, Mrs. Ferris, whichever way it goes." He turned his horse and rode off, and this time Odessa did not watch him go, because she had eggs to gather and a heat box to check and no more time to spend on a man who had already decided she would fail. The hatching box came due on the 21st of February, the 21st day since she'd set the eggs, and she stayed up through the cold night, checking the box every hour, the way a mother might sit up with a sick child, listening for the first faint sounds of movement inside the shells. By dawn, 41 of the 72 eggs had hatched into damp, exhausted chicks that dried within hours into a soft yellow fuzz, and she stood in the lantern light of the small brooding room with her hands cupped around one of them, feeling its tiny heartbeat against her palm, and found herself crying for the first time since the funeral. Not from sorrow this time, but from something that felt dangerously close to joy, an emotion she had almost forgotten how to recognize in her own chest. 41 new pullets would not lay for another 20 weeks, not until midsummer, well past the April deadline, and she knew that plainly enough, not to let the joy convince her the debt was solved. But it meant something beyond the immediate arithmetic. It meant Thomas's unfinished plan, abandoned for want of an answer he never got to hear, had finally been carried through to its end, 3 years after he first sketched it, and 4 months after he died, still not knowing the solution, had been sitting in a neighbor's memory the whole time. She wrote a single line in the ledger that night, beneath the day's egg count. 41 hatched. Thomas's box finally worked. It was the closest she let herself come to speaking to him directly in all the months since November. Through March, the lantern-lit flock's daily count climbed further still, driven now by lengthening natural daylight, working in tandem with the artificial hours she'd added, reaching 28 eggs a day by the second week of the month, then 30 by the third, matching at last the number Thomas had written in his journal a year before he died as his hoped-for target. The number he had never lived to see realized. Odessa sold eggs to Redfern's store, to both boarding houses now, and even, on 2 occasions, to a hotel in the next town over, whose usual supplier had gone through a hard winter of their own. She counted the tin box each week with a discipline that bordered on ritual, watching the sum climb from $40 toward the 100 mark, then past it, the arithmetic finally beginning to close the gap that had seemed, in December, wide enough to swallow her whole. By the 1st of April, with 2 weeks remaining before the debt came due, she had accumulated $312, counting what she had saved before winter and everything the flock had earned, since the lanterns and the reflectors and the hatching box had all begun their quiet work. $88 short still, with 14 days left and a flock producing 30 eggs daily, which at the current rate would bring in perhaps another $40 before the deadline arrived, leaving her still short by a margin that made her chest tight every time she did the sum. It was Prudence Ostrander again who offered the last piece, arriving unannounced at the Ferris farm on a morning in early April with a wagon and a look of quiet purpose Odessa had not seen from her before.
"I've 11 goats and more milk than I know what to do with," Prudence said. "And you've got eggs enough now to spare a portion without starving your own table. Redfern tells me the hotel in Millbrook's been asking after fresh goat cheese since their usual supplier moved on. I say we go into town together, you with your eggs and me with my cheese, and split the wagon costs and see what a partnership does for both our ledgers before your deadline comes." It was not charity, and Prudence made sure to say so plainly, because charity was not a thing either woman would have accepted from the other, but a plain trade of convenience between 2 women who had each been managing alone for longer than either cared to admit.
Together they made the trip to Millbrook twice in the remaining 2 weeks, and Odessa's share of the combined sales, added to what the flock brought in locally, closed the gap by the 12th of April with $2 to spare. On the morning of the 15th, Odessa rode into Larkspur Crossing with $402 in a cloth sack, more cash than she had held in her hands at one time in all her 25 years, and walked into the bank to find Mr. Alden Pruitt at his desk, visibly startled when she laid the money out and counted it in front of him. $402, Pruitt said, recounting it himself, as though his own eyes might have deceived him the first time. "I'll confess, Mrs. Ferris, I did not expect this outcome in December." "Neither did I," Odessa said, and found she meant it honestly, without either false modesty or excessive pride, only the plain acknowledgment of a thing that had been genuinely uncertain and was now, at last, decided. She was still at the bank counter, waiting for the receipt to be written out, when Harmon Voss walked in on some unrelated business of his own, and stopped short at the sight of her standing there with an empty cloth sack and a paid receipt in hand. He said nothing for a moment, only looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, and then he touched his hat, the same gesture he'd offered in December, though it carried a different weight now. "Mrs. Ferris," he said, "I expect I owe you an apology for doubting you'd manage it." "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Voss," Odessa said. "You offered a fair trade for what you believed was true at the time. It happened not to be true. That's not the same as wronging me." Voss nodded slowly, something almost like respect settling into his features now without reservation. "Well," he said, "if you ever find yourself with more eggs than Redfern's store can take, I'd be glad to talk business on different terms than the ones I offered before." "I'll keep that in mind," Odessa said, and left the bank with a lightness in her step that had been absent from her for the better part of a year. She rode home past the frozen fields, turning slowly toward mud and green at their edges, past the Ostrander place, where Prudence stood in her yard with a goat on a lead rope, and lifted a hand in greeting without breaking from her work, and past the small, marked grave on the rise above the house, where she stopped, as she often did, and stood a while in the cold spring wind. She did not speak aloud to Thomas, not exactly, but she stood with the ledger tucked under her arm, the one that now recorded 30 eggs a day and a debt paid in full, and she felt, standing there, that some circle had closed that had needed closing since November. She walked back down to the hen house afterward and opened the ledger to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top, and beneath it the day's count: 31 eggs, one more than Thomas had ever dared hope for. And beneath that she wrote nothing else at all, because the numbers said everything that needed saying, plain and unadorned, the way Thomas himself had always preferred it. The following autumn, the 41 hatched pullets came into their own first laying season, adding their number to the flock's daily count until it climbed past 50, and Odessa Ferris stood in her henhouse doorway some cold morning still, watching her breath curl into the dark the way she had that first terrible winter. Except now the counting she did was not out of desperation, but out of the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had built something with her own 2 hands, out of a dead man's unfinished notebook and a neighbor's decade of unspoken knowledge, and who had, in the end, needed no rescue at all beyond the willingness to keep asking questions until she found the ones that had answers. If this story of quiet frontier grit found its way into your heart tonight, you know exactly what to do. Drop a comment telling me which part stayed with you the longest. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and share this video with someone who could use a reminder that the hardest winters do eventually give way to spring. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I will see you in the next story.